There are some stories that stay with you. Not because they ended well, but because of what one person chose to do when they had every reason to choose differently. This is one of those stories. And we think, by the end of it, you'll understand why we couldn't let it go unheard. Her name was Lily Vance, and by the time she was 22, she had learned that the world does not always soften itself for the grieving. Her father had died in February. A quiet man, a woodworker, a person who measured worth in the straightness of a joint and the patience of a hand plane. He left her no money, he left her no property. What he left her was a set of chisels wrapped in oilcloth, a leather apron worn soft at the pocket edges, and a name that meant nothing to the people in the town of Kellerton, Ontario, except as an afterthought. She was Lily Vance, daughter of the late Edwin Vance, the carpenter who'd rented the corner of someone else's barn for 30 years and called it a workshop. The house they had rented together went back to the landlord within the week. Lily packed what she could carry: the chisels, the apron, 2 dresses, a small pot, and the thing her father had always said would find its use someday: a hand-forged drawknife, long and curved, with handles of pale ash that had darkened over decades with the oil of her father's palms. It had belonged to his own teacher before him, a man named Reuben Schofield, a chairmaker out of Guelph, who had died before Lily was born and who had, according to her father, been the finest craftsman in 3 counties. The drawknife was the kind of tool that made woodworkers stop and look twice. It was not sentimental, it was simply extraordinary. She took the morning train north because north was what she could afford. The ticket cost her what she had, and what she had was nearly nothing. We want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is important. She was not unlucky in the ordinary sense. She had not lost a gamble or made a poor decision. She had simply been a daughter, and her father had died, and the world had not built a soft place for her to land. That is not tragedy in the storybook sense. That is the particular, grinding difficulty that ordinary people carry without anyone writing songs about it. The train ran north along the edge of the shield, through towns that looked like they had grown out of the rock and spruce by accident, and stayed because leaving was too much effort. Lily watched them pass from the window, each one a version of the same question. Could she put down here? Could this one hold her? She got off at a town called Dunmore's Landing, which is not a place you would find on many maps today, but which existed then as a real and tired little settlement built around a closed sawmill and a still functioning grain elevator. It sat at the edge of a lake that had no tourist name, only the one the Ojibwe had always called it, and the dock had half its boards replaced with newer wood that hadn't weathered yet, so it looked like a smile with mismatched teeth. She asked at the feed store about work. She asked at the hotel. She asked at the church hall, where a woman with an efficient manner and a great deal of keys on her belt told her that there was no work in Dunmore's Landing and hadn't been since the mill closed 3 years prior, and that she was sorry, but there it was. Lily walked back through town. She had $2.14. She had a bedroll and a canvas bag and a drawknife that a dead chairmaker had shaped from a single billet of steel sometime in the 1860s. And then she saw the auction. It was not much of an auction. A dozen people stood in the cold gray light of an October morning behind the old feed warehouse, watching a man in a brown coat read from a list. Most of what was for sale was junk, broken machinery, a wagon with one wheel, crates of hardware no one wanted. But in the far corner of the lot, half hidden by a stand of birch that had forced its roots under the fence, there was a building she hadn't noticed before. It was a trapper's cash house, small, maybe 12 feet by 16, built of squared logs that had gone silver with age. The door was fitted with a hasp and a padlock that had rusted entirely shut, not locked in the ordinary sense, but fused, the metal merged by decades of freeze and thaw into a single useless mass. There was a small window, but someone had nailed boards across it so long ago that the nails had bled rust streaks down the logs in long red lines, like something weeping. No one had been inside that building in a very long time. The auctioneer reached it on his list and paused, looking over his glasses at the small crowd. Old storage cache, back corner of the lot, contents unknown, padlock seized shut, sold as is, no representations. He glanced around. Anyone start me at 5? Silence. 3 then. More silence. $2. Lily's hand went up before she had fully decided why. The auctioneer looked at her. $2. Do I have $2.50? No one moved. Sold, he said, and wrote something on his paper. She had spent almost everything she had on a building no one could open. The man standing next to her, a farmer in his 60s with a face creased from weather and something that might have been amusement, leaned over and said, "Bought yourself a puzzle." "Looks like," said Lily. "You know what's in it?" "No." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided you're either foolish or interesting and haven't made up their mind which. Then he walked away. We want to stop here and ask you something, because we've been thinking about it since we first heard this story. Have you ever done something, spent something, chosen something, on a feeling you couldn't quite defend? Not reckless, exactly, not stupid, but a pull, a certainty that lived in the chest rather than the head. We think most people have. And we think most people have also learned, one way or another. Whether that pull was worth listening. Now and Dunmore landing in the church hall on a cot, the woman with the keys produced without ceremony and with the clear implication that it was a one-time offer. She lay awake and thought about the cash house. She thought about the padlock. She thought about what her father had told her once, when she was small and frustrated with a board that wouldn't cooperate. The wood already knows what it wants to be. You're just help it get there. She had thought at the time that this was the kind of thing fathers said to make children feel better. Now she understood it differently. In the morning, she went to the lot before the light had properly arrived and stood in front of the cash house and looked at the padlock. It was large, the kind made in the previous century, with a body the size of a fist and a shackle that had corroded into the hasp at 2 points. The keyhole was completely oxidized. There was no opening this with a key. There was, possibly, no opening this at all. But Lily had grown up watching her father work. She had spent years in a workshop where the question was never whether a thing could be done, but only which approach would do it without causing more harm than necessary. She went back to town and knocked on the door of the blacksmith's shop. The man who answered was tall, somewhere in his 50s, with forearms that told the whole story of his occupation. His name was Cornelius Duff, and he was one of those people who listen first and speak second, which Lily recognized immediately as a form of respect she hadn't encountered much lately. She explained what she had. She explained what she needed. He came to look at the padlock and stood in front of it for a long time without touching it. Then he went back to his shop and came back with a cold chisel and a short-handled hammer and a can of oil. He worked for the better part of an hour, patient and methodical, speaking only to explain what he was doing and why. The oil first worked into every seam, then heat from a small torch, just enough to expand the metal, then the chisel at the shackle, not to cut it but to work it, to find the give. When the padlock finally gave, it didn't break so much as surrender. The hasp fell free. The door swung inward on its own weight. The smell that came out was time itself, cold and dry and layered, like old paper and pine resin, and something darker underneath, animal and old. Lily stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. What she saw first were the shelves, floor to ceiling along 3 walls, rough lumber shelves that had been built with care, each one evenly spaced and level. On the shelves were crates, small ones, the kind used for hardware or dry goods, each one with a paper label tacked to the face. The labels were yellowed but legible. And then she saw what was in the middle of the floor, beneath a canvas that had stiffened and gone gray with age. It was a chair, not a chair the way most people think of chairs. A Windsor chair, perhaps the finest she had ever seen, with a comb back and spindles, turned so thin they seemed impossible, and a seat shaped with a travisher's hollow that was, even under dust, visibly perfect. It sat on the canvas as though it were waiting, as though someone had set it there and meant to come back. She knew what she was looking at. Her father had spoken of work like this. Reuben Schofield, his old teacher, had made chairs like this in the years before his hands had failed him. Lily crouched down and looked at the underside of the seat, stamped into the wood, small and precise. R. Schofield, Guelph, 1871. She sat back on her heels and stayed very still for a long time. The drawknife in her bag had come from this man's hands. The muscle memory her father had spent his life acquiring had come, in a long chain of passing on, from this man. And here, in a sealed building in a town she had arrived at by accident, was his work, sitting in the dark for no one. This is the part of the story, we think, where most people would have felt the romance of it and moved on, found a nice ending in the coincidence and let it be. But Lily was her father's daughter, and her father had been a practical man. He had taught her that sentiment without action is decoration. What matters is what you do with the feeling once you have it. She opened the crates. The first contained hardware, hinges, small ones, hand-forged, wrapped in cloth that had long since rotted. The second contained chair parts, pre-turned spindles, dozens of them, each one wrapped individually in paper. The third contained what appeared to be ledgers. There were 4 of them, cloth-bound, their spines cracked and pages swollen from the cold. She brought them to the light of the doorway and opened the first one. It was an order book, names, dates, descriptions of pieces commissioned and delivered, payments received. The handwriting was small and very even. It ran from 1868 to 1874. She opened the second. More orders, more names, but near the back of this one, the handwriting changed, became less even. And then in the last pages was a letter, folded and tucked inside the back cover. It was addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to anyone who ever found it, which amounts to the same thing. Lily read it standing in the doorway of the cash house in the thin October light, and we are going to tell you what it said, because it is the center of everything that comes after. The letter had been written by Reuben Schofield himself in the winter of 1882. He was 57 years old at the time. His hands had begun to shake. He wrote about this matter-of-factly, the way craftsmen often discuss the end of their craft, which is also the end of the version of themselves they have been longest. He had come north to Dunmore's Landing to live out his remaining years with his daughter and her husband. The cash house had been his workshop, small as it was, and then his storage, and then simply a place where his things waited while he no longer had the hands to use them. In the letter, Reuben Schofield described something he had never told anyone while he was alive. In 1876, his son-in-law, a man named Philip Grant, who served as the town's land agent, had borrowed money from him, a substantial sum, savings that Schofield had put aside over a decade of work. The stated purpose was to pay off a debt on a parcel of land that several Dunmore's Landing families had been farming collectively, a debt held by a bank in Toronto that was threatening to foreclose. Grant had presented himself as the intermediary, the person who would carry the funds to Toronto and settle the matter. He had not done this. The debt had been settled, eventually, but not with Schofield's money. The bank had agreed to a restructured arrangement the families knew nothing of until years later. Grant had kept the money, and by the time Schofield understood what had happened, Grant had covered his tracks well enough that there was no clean way to prove it, and Schofield was old and shaking and did not want to break his daughter's life apart over a thing he could no longer remedy. But he had written it down, names, dates, the sum, everything he knew, and he had added one more thing. The chairs he had made, 6 of them, sold to families in Dunmore's Landing over the years. Each one contained, in the hollow beneath the seat, a small compartment. Nothing dramatic. Just a clean cavity in the wood, sealed with a fitted plug, undetectable if you didn't know to look. And in each compartment, Schofield had placed a note that matched what was in the ledger. A record of what he believed was owed to that family, by his estimation, based on their share of the original communal debt and what Grant had taken. He had done this because he had nothing else left to give. He was an old man with bad hands and no money, and a son-in-law who had stolen from him and from the people around him. All he had was the truth, and the chairs, and the hope that someday someone would understand what they found. Lily stood in the doorway for a very long time. Then she went and found Cornelius Duff the blacksmith and told him what she had found. We need to be honest with you about what happened next, because it is not the part of the story that makes good drama. It was slow. It took most of the winter. Lily stayed in Dunmore's Landing. Cornelius Duff, who had lived in the town for 30 years and knew every family in it, let her use the small room above his shop in exchange for work. Because he had seen the chisels and the drawknife and understood that he was looking at someone who knew what they were doing. She helped him when the work allowed it, and in the evenings she worked through the ledgers. There were 6 families named. 3 were still represented in Dunmore's Landing by children or grandchildren. 2 had moved away, though Cornelius knew where they'd gone. One family's line had ended with a woman who had died without children in 1931, and that portion of the reckoning, Lily decided, would go to the church hall that had given her a cot on her first night. She located the 6 chairs. This took time. 2 were still in the families who'd originally owned them. 1 was in the back of the hotel. 1 was in the schoolhouse. 2 required letters to be written and answers to be waited upon. Then she asked Cornelius Duff if he would be willing to be present when she opened them as a witness, because she had enough of her father's pragmatism to understand that a 22-year-old woman alone is not believed as readily as a 22-year-old woman with a blacksmith beside her who has lived in the community for 30 years. Cornelius said he would. He said it the way he said most things, which was simply, without elaboration, which Lily had come to understand was its own form of eloquence. The first chair was the one from the cash house, the chair that bore Schofield's stamp. The compartment was exactly where the letter said it would be. A fitted plug in the deepest part of the hollow seat, the edges so clean and tight you would never find it by looking. Lily used a thin chisel, her father's, and worked carefully until the plug came free. Inside was a folded paper, water-stained at the edges but legible. A name, a date, a number. She did not let herself feel anything about it until she had opened all 6, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her to finish a thing before you sit down. When all 6 were open and all 6 papers were laid on the workbench beside the ledger, she sat down. Cornelius put a cup of tea in front of her, said nothing, and went back to his work. The sound of the forge was, in that moment, the most ordinary and human sound she had ever heard. The total, by Schofield's accounting, was a sum that in 1876 had represented a significant portion of those families' security. 60 years had passed. The money itself was not there. Only the record, the intention, the named debt. What Lily had in her possession was not currency. It was evidence. It was a dead man's testimony about what had been taken and from whom. What she had in the cash house, though, was something else. The chairs were, by any reasonable assessment, remarkable objects. The single Windsor in the cash house was in extraordinary condition, having spent 60 years in a dry, cold building. The spindles, hundreds of them, pre-turned and wrapped in paper, were intact. The hardware, even oxidized as it was hand-forged and well-made. There was, Lily understood with the practical eye her father had given her, real material value here, as well as the kind of value that people who care about such things will pay for. She was not going to keep it. This is the part we want to tell you carefully, because it is easy to misunderstand. It was not that she was selfless in the way of saints or stories. She was a young woman with very little, and she would have been entirely justified in doing something else with what she found. No one would have blamed her. The law was on her side. She had bought the cash house and its contents for $2 at a lawful auction. What was in it was hers. But she sat with the ledger and the papers from the chair seats and thought about 6 families who had, 60 years ago, been made smaller by a thing done in the dark. Their names were in the book. Their loss was there, in Schofield's small, even handwriting. A man who was dying and shaking, and couldn't give them the money back, had done the only thing he could think of, which was to leave proof, in the finest work of his hands, for whoever came after. She thought she might be the whoever. Lily wrote letters. She asked for help, reading the legal aspects from a solicitor in the nearest larger town. A woman named Mrs. Annette Burgess, who handled mostly farm transactions and wills, and who read through the situation with the kind of steady care that good solicitors apply to everything, regardless of drama. Mrs. Annette Burgess said that the Grant family, Philip Grant, had been dead since 1908, but his grandson still farmed land north of town, could be approached, but that a legal remedy after this many decades was unlikely to be clean or swift. She said that the evidence was real and credible, but that the decision of what to do with it was Lily's, and that she should think carefully about what outcome she actually wanted. Lily thought about it for a week. Then she went to see the 3 families still in Dunmore's Landing. We are not going to tell you those conversations were simple, because they weren't. Some of them were painful in ways that surprised her. One family didn't want to know. Another family had already known. They had suspected Philip Grant for years, had watched him prosper on land they couldn't buy back, and the confirmation didn't bring relief so much as a reopening. The third family, the Penhallows, grandchildren of the original name in the ledger, were silent for a long time, and then the grandmother said quietly that she was glad someone had finally found it. There was a small auction, in the spring, of the Windsor chair, and the pre-turned spindles, and the hand-forged hardware. Lily managed it herself, with Cornelius Duff as her second. People came from as far as Toronto because word had gotten to the right ears about Schofield's work, and what they paid was, by the standards of Dunmore's Landing, astonishing. The proceeds were divided, not equally. Lily had worked through the proportions in the ledger as carefully as she could, and Mrs. Annette Burgess had reviewed her arithmetic, and what went to each family was proportional to what Schofield had recorded as owed. The family that had no living heirs had their share go to the church hall. The 2 families who had moved away received letters, and then checks, and in one case a visit, because the eldest daughter of one of those families drove up from Barrie and sat in Cornelius Duff's shop and cried for a long time, not about the money, she said, but about being found. Lily kept the drawknife, which had never been for sale. She kept the oilcloth it was wrapped in. She kept the apron. She set up a small workshop in the back corner of the cash house, with Cornelius Duff's help, because the building was sound and dry and had shelves already built, and because it had turned out that Dunmore's Landing had, in fact, one thing it needed: someone who could make things right. By the following winter she had 3 commissions, small ones, repair work mostly, but real. By the year after that, she had taught 2 people what she knew, which was how it had always worked. One pair of hands to the next, one generation to the next. A drawknife passed from Reuben Schofield to Edwin Vance to Lily, carrying in its weight and its balance everything it had touched. The cash house still stands if you go looking. The logs have gone darker with the years, and the window has real glass now. There's a small sign above the door that most people drive past without reading. We won't tell you what it says, because we think you already know. What we will tell you is this. The $2 Lily Vance spent at that auction on a building no one could open became, in the long reckoning, the most precisely placed $2 in the history of Dunmore's Landing. Not because of what was inside it, because of who was standing outside it, with the right hands and the patience to ask the right questions. And we want to ask you one now, before we go. Was there ever something that looked, to everyone around you, like a mistake? Something you reached for that didn't make sense on paper? That you couldn't have explained, if someone had asked, with any argument that would have satisfied them? We'd love to know. Leave it in the comments, if you're willing. 'Cause we think those stories are the ones that stay with us longest. And this place, Cabin Stories, is where we keep them.